My name is Piers Bizony, and I'm a science writer in England. And I've been writing about all kinds of science, but space history has really, really fascinated me ever since I was a kid. I did a book about Stanley Kubrick's 2001, how they made that movie, and that's still on sale more than 10 years after I did it. I did a book about Yuri Gagarin because it turns out that all we know about Yuri Gagarin is his name, and what happened to him after he came home was in a sense much more interesting than what happened to him before he went up. After he came home, he was kind of a victim, an early victim of the cult of personality and the cult of celebrity. He also tried to save the life of the first human being to actually die during a space mission, which was Vladimir Komarov. So Gagarin went up against the Soviet system to try to get them to see some sense about not launching the Soyuz spacecraft before it was ready, and he wasn't very successful at that, but he tried. Do you mind, gentlemen, if we move you over this way so that I'm not scanning you, I'm not rastering you with my eyeballs here? So I was born in, well, let me see, a long time ago, 1959, so that by the time I was still a young boy, the space age was really kicking off, and by the time Apollo came along, I was at exactly that age, 9, 10, 11, to be really appreciative of the excitement of it. But even as it was happening, I was asking myself, well, who's made all this happening, and what's going on, who is in charge of it, who's behind all this? I was obviously fascinated by the astronauts, and always I loved the hardware, but I knew that there was more to it. I had an instinct that there was more to it behind the scenes that I wasn't understanding from the news reports of those beautiful Saturn V's standing there. And that's a question I continued to ask myself as I got educated and learned about how the world works and about politics and about the military-industrial side of space exploration. I wanted to know who ran Apollo. I kept coming across this name of a very, very decent, very honorable gentleman called Thomas Paine. And he was on the NASA reports heralding the achievements of Apollo 8 around the moon, the Apollo 9 was the Earth orbital test of the LEM, Apollo 10, and finally Apollo 11. And I thought, okay, Thomas Paine is the head of NASA, he's made all this happen. It was only some years later, in my teens, that I realized that Thomas Paine only came to NASA in, 1968 or something. So who had been in charge all through the 1960s while you'd had the Mercury program going on and while you'd had the Gemini program going on and the lead up to Apollo? And so I came across this character that nobody else in my family and nobody else that I'd ever spoken to had heard of. A North Carolina lawyer turned Washington insider called James Edwin Webb. And so a strange fascination for me began. I wanted to learn more and more about him. So I looked in the available public records and the available popular histories of spaceflight, and guess what? I couldn't find him. The astronaut biographies, and I've read loads of astronaut biographies, and they're very exciting, but the astronauts all do their work at Houston, or they go to Florida to get launched. Jim Webb, for them was just this guy, this name, in far-off Washington, who occasionally would send down commands, which the astronauts would either say, yes, he's on our side, or no, typical bureaucrats getting in our way again. Again, I couldn't find Jim Webb anywhere in these stories, and yet he was the guy who led the agency that put human beings on the moon and did so much more besides. So eventually, when I raised the money to go to Washington and get a book going and research this character, and I found just the most amazing thing. I found, ladies and gentlemen, an exciting bureaucrat. And I have been telling people ever since that the glamour side of space is to be a scientist building microshuttles. That's absolutely fantastic. To be an astronaut riding the shuttle, and that's absolutely fantastic. But there's a hazardous profession on the ground too, and a noble and exciting profession, and that is to administer these programs, to make them happen. So I did a book on him. And while I was doing the book, I obviously discovered and learnt more about the fact that the James Webb Space Telescope is being named after him. I discovered also that there's some controversy about this, that some scientists were wondering why the name of a not particularly publicly well-known administrator and bureaucrat and government insider should be given to a telescope. Why was the telescope not being called after a famous scientist? Why was it not being called Galileo 2 or something like that? or Newton, or who knows, it's not a Newtonian refractor. What might have been a good Renaissance scientist to call it after, do you think, Pam?
Tycho Brahe.
Brahe, exactly. It could have been called the Brahe Observatory or something. So why call it after James E. Webb? So I'm here today to tell you a little about James E. Webb and to tell you how he fought for a science program in the 1960s. Now, if I'm teaching anyone to suck eggs, if there are any people in the room who are already familiar with James Webb's deep background, I apologize, but I'm going to tell my story the way I came across it. In 1961, when Jack Kennedy came to the White House, this president, who was famous above perhaps anything else for making the decision to go to the moon, he didn't care about space. Nobody cared about space. When they were trawling around for federal appointments, the NASA administrator was the last appointment they made practically. They'd filled all the other seats. Everybody flocked to the new Camelot White House to get an exciting job in the Kennedy administration. But they couldn't find anyone to lead NASA. There were two problems. First is that Kennedy had decided, okay, I need to get Lyndon Johnson, this powerful Texas politician. He's my vice president now. I've put him into a place where he's going to be less of a threat to me. He's not going to run against me. He's not going to be in Congress as a senator anymore, making trouble for me. I'm going to make him my powerless, toothless vice president. But at the same time, he has been one of the most enormously powerful Democrat politicians ever, and I've got to give him something that will maintain his self-respect and give him something to do. So I'll put him in charge of the Space Council. He can go off and play with the space cadets. You know, he'll be out of my hair. So Kennedy at this time was completely unaware of how important space was going to be to national policy. And so was everybody else. They asked 16, 17, 18 major figures in science, in public administration, in industry, will you come and lead NASA because somebody's got to do it? And they turned the White House down. So Kennedy turned to Johnson and said, you're in charge of this, you know, you're making me look bad. We can't find someone to head this space agency. You know, suddenly it's important because it's important in the sense that nobody wants this job, and that's making it seem important in all the wrong ways. Just deal with this damn problem. So Johnson casts around, and his friend, a very powerful Democrat senator called Robert Kerr, says, well, you know, there's this fellow who's worked around government in the Bureau of Budget in the Truman years. He's been Undersecretary of State. He's worked with me at the Kerr-McGee Oil and Nuclear Company in Oklahoma. You know, he's a good Democrat. He's, you know, when he was a kid, he was working with the Roosevelt administration on education programs. He knows a bit about business. He's called Jim Webb. Why don't I send Jim Webb up to you, and you can see if he wants to lead NASA. So Johnson said, yeah, get him in my office right away. So Jim Webb gets the call. He gets the call actually from the White House science advisor. And he said, what? You know, I've been working in private industry. I'm out of government now because we've had the Eisenhower administration. I'm 52 years old. I wasn't actually thinking of going back into public service. Oh, please, 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 come and at least talk to people. So he comes to Vice President Johnson, and Johnson tells him in no uncertain terms, you're going to lead up NASA. Well, I don't want to. Yes, you are. Okay. So Webb has to think really fast, and he thinks, oh my God, I've got Lyndon Johnson bullying me to lead NASA. What do I do? Well, I've got to take a risk here. I can't have this invitation from the Vice President. If I'm going to lead NASA, if I'm not going to make a fool of myself, if 18 other people have turned this job down, I've got to get myself some power. Now, just the next few minutes is all I have to get myself some favors. So he turns to Johnson and says, I'll only take this job if the President of the United States personally asks me to take it. So they whisk him round to the White House. And Kennedy is just relieved to see anyone who's even considering taking this job. And so Webb says, look, you know, you're going to put me in charge of NASA. You're not going to have some preconceived notion. You know, if you put me in charge, I can run it. And Kennedy said, yeah, absolutely, as long as you take the job. You know, I know you've got policy experience. I know you know your way around Washington. I promise you, you know, we'll leave you alone. Just take the job. So Kennedy thinks that he's flattered Webb into taking the job. But what Webb has actually secured is authority to run NASA more or less as he sees fit. Now, of course, not literally in that way, but he's certainly secured that favor. Kennedy is always going to be looking at Webb, no matter how irritating Webb becomes. And Kennedy is always going to know that Webb is the man who got the Kennedy White House out of a jam by taking this job that nobody else in Washington wanted. Point number one to Webb. So Webb had experience with Sperry gyroscopes in the Second World War as a vice president there, so he's reasonably business savvy. He's had experience in the education sector. He's passionately concerned with it. He knows the universities. He knows all of the political strings and skeletons in Washington. But he doesn't know about rockets. So he comes across a rather sad and dejected Hugh L. Dryden. Now, Dryden was the chief of the NACA, the precursor to NASA in the 1950s, which pioneered so much fantastic aeronautical research. The NACA, along with the Air Force, built the X-15 rocket plane, which, if only history had been different, might well have been your first orbital spacecraft. As the Harrison Storms at North American said, you know, if you just let us beef it up a little. The X-15 rocket plane was just a fantastic thing, and history overtook it. If the X-15 rocket plane had been given another 5 or 6 years, it could have become a spaceship. But suddenly, America needed to get into space, not in 5 or 6 years, but 5 or 6 months. Just as Webb was taking control of NASA, the Russians pulled a fast one, and they put Yuri Gagarin into orbit. And so suddenly Webb found himself in this urgent race to pull his agency together, get all the field centers working in a cohesive way, and catch up with the Russians. Kennedy now found that he had an important decision to make. How was America going to catch up with the Russians? And instead of having a sort of a smooth Boston East Coast kind of buddy in the Kennedy clan that he felt comfortable with, he had this loudmouth, bulky, garrulous North Carolina hick. And so Kennedy was faintly appalled and sort of, God, I've got this damn Webb person I have to deal with. And then he had Lyndon Johnson running around like a bull in a china shop. So Kennedy wrote this famous memo to Lyndon Johnson, and he said, look, we have to catch up with the Russians now. Is there any way we can do this in a reasonable time frame by putting up a space station or some science program maybe, or sending a man around the moon, or perhaps putting a man on the moon and bringing him back? And if those aren't, you know, good options, is there any other space program that we can reasonably expect to win? So Lyndon Johnson called this very high-profile meeting of government advisors, commercial pals, and of course Jim Webb. And he said, gentlemen, and it was gentlemen in those days, I'm afraid, we have a very difficult decision to make. Should America put a man on the moon? So Lyndon Johnson basically made up his mind that putting a man on the moon was the thing to do. And guess who was the one voice in the room who said, just steady on here, let's be really careful? It was Jim Webb. He was being handed on a plate this possibility of building NASA into, you know, the greatest organization with one of the greatest projects in human history. And he was pulling back. And again, he was being very, very clever. He was really, really forcing Lyndon Johnson and then Kennedy to come to him and tell him again and again, do it. Do this particular job. And Johnson didn't get this. He was going around the room saying, Webb, what's the matter with you? You're nuts. You should be why aren't you advocating this? Why aren't you tearing my arm off? I'm giving you what you need here. And Webb was saying, you're giving me what I need now, this year. Next year is going to be different. And in 6, 7, 8 years when we make the landing, it's going to be different still. If you tell NASA to do this, you have to be sure that you are going to give us the political support, not just now, but for a decade to come. You really have to think about this. You really have to know what you're getting into. And Webb gave the same message to Kennedy as well. So again, he was playing a classic bureaucratic game of not revealing his cards, not revealing, obviously, that he was, you know, fairly excited that NASA was going to be growing into a big, important agency, and he was going to be in charge of it. He was making sure that you know, there was going to be political momentum behind this. So then, as the lunar decision looked like it was going to be made, obviously it was time to go and put some figures together. So Webb returns to NASA headquarters and he pulls all these people around him and he says, look, don't get excited, but you know, it looks like we're going to the moon, but I need some figures. I need to take some figures up to the Hill. I need to take some figures up to the White House. Go away and tell me what this is going to cost over the coming decade. So they come back and very, very sheepishly they report, and this is 1960s dollars, remember. Well, it could cost $9, $10 billion to get this done. And Webb says, oh, come on, give me a break. You know, you're assuming that everything is going to go right, first time, every time. Go away, be realistic. So they come back and they said, okay, Mr. Webb, in all seriousness, we're probably looking at $13 billion. So they're thinking, my God, he's going to go up to Congress and up to the president. He's going to tell them that figure, and my God, they're just going to be appalled. Well, of course, Webb doesn't do that. There's no way he goes to the president of the United States and says, you know, you need to commit $13 billion over the next 6, 7, 8 years to get this job done. No. He says it's going to cost $20 billion. And so Kennedy says, my God, that's an appalling sum of money. And Congress says, my God, that's an appalling sum of money. But the fever is so great. As Webb recorded, he found Congress in a runaway mood. They say, okay, well, we have to do this. And so the initiative begins, and everybody has that $20 billion figure in their mind of what it's going to cost to put America on the moon by the end of the decade. And when Webb gets back to NASA headquarters, and all his colleagues are saying, my God, that's a hell of a risk you took there. Where did you get that $20 billion from? Did you pluck that out of thin air? And Webb said, I call it my administrator's discount. Now, there were, of course, tremendous clawbacks, year-on-year fights to see the Apollo budgets through. But the point is, there were clawbacks from a figure which Webb had set high. So that, in fact, you can look at the Apollo figures, and one way you can read them is, okay, there were overspends. But another way you can read them is, in fact, America didn't spend more than $20 billion over that period. It was getting $3 billion a year, $4 billion a year, $5 billion a year. But on the moon program, in fact, everything came in pretty much the way Webb said it would. What he was doing was preparing America, giving America the bad news first, so that, you know, if they spent more than $13 billion, which is, of course, what happened, they would still be under the figure that he'd warned everybody they might have to expect. So again, he was very, very clever. Then he had to figure out how to get to the moon and how to get NASA into an organization instead of a collection of field centers. I mean, you've all been working in field centers now where you have had the NASA branding on you for a very long time, for half a century. But a lot of those field centers have ancient histories. Some of those field centers predate NASA. And so Webb found himself having to pull together these entities into something that was going to have a cohesive vision. And here you had quite a lot of internecine warfare because, and I'm sure the same is the case today, the field centers feel themselves often quite distinct from headquarters. They feel that headquarters is either with them or against them on any given initiative. There's not necessarily that sense, and it's understandable that headquarters and the field centers are part of the same organization. So Webb looked at this and said, look, the field centers have to be answerable to the programs, not to themselves. They have to be answerable to the programs, and the programs are answerable to head office. He ran a fiefdom. But at the same time as he was running a fiefdom, he decided to institute a flat organization. He wanted to make sure that the field center directors could report directly to NASA headquarters without having to go through too many layers in between. He wanted to institute, too, that engineers who were cutting metal could report directly to very senior levels in NASA without having to be cut off by their middle managers. We'll talk about middle management cutoff later as it applied to the space shuttle. So he instituted a flat organization where sometimes people would actually take, not necessarily salary cuts, but they would certainly take rank cuts, because they would find a job at a junior level more interesting to do than at a senior level. But it didn't matter to them because the organization was so flat at this point that, you know, stepping up or down a level was not the issue. The issue was whether or not you were having an exciting job to do. And Webb was joined in this initiative by Bob Siemens, who was his associate director, and by Hugh Dryden, who was the NACA old hand, the wise father figure of the space age. And Webb turned to these three guys and said, look, you've been in NACA, Bob Siemens, you've been around missiles and all kinds of programs, and you've been in NASA before me. I don't know about rockets. So what we'll do is, we will have all the field center directors report to us, and maybe to just 2 or 3 program office heads below us. But essentially, we will run NASA as a triumvirate. We will have 3 people at the top of NASA, myself, and I will deal with the politicians. Hugh Dryden, you will be our advisor, if you like, our elder statesman, and Bob Siemens, you will be the NASA general manager. You will manage those day-to-day affairs and those technical matters that I can't do because I'm either not experienced or I'm dealing with the Washington politicians and keeping them off your back. All I ask is that I can trust you. Everybody in NASA has to be able to trust each other, otherwise this is not going to work. So for a long time, this system worked. From 1961 to 1966, NASA was a pretty flat organization where things got done at a remarkable pace and with a remarkable success rate. And I'll tell you, one of the places that had an incredible success rate was the Goddard Space Flight Center. Now, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name. Is it Harry Goett was the director at the time? Yeah. Harry Goett, thank you. Now, between 1961 and 1965, Harry Goett had an almost unbroken series of launch successes, and he put something like more than 100 instruments up into space. He was just a remarkable, remarkable man. His ability to work with contractors and get them to do good work was astounding. By the same token, JPL was having an appalling series of failures. They just really couldn't handle their contractor relationships. They didn't really understand how to test systems. They had early lunar probes that were just failing and failing and failing time and time again. And yet JPL is the one that had Jim Webb's support. Congress was thinking maybe we should cut JPL here. It's just not doing good enough work. And Harry Goett and Goddard, you know what they did to him? You know what Webb did to him? Asked him to resign. Because Harry Goett wasn't towing the headquarters line. Harry Goett was just going ahead and getting the job done and doing the paperwork afterwards. So it's very, very interesting that success in the technical sense didn't necessarily win Webb's respect. He wanted NASA to be able to defend itself against its enemies by being accountable in certain kinds of ways. He didn't want to get tripped up. He always used to warn people it's the small things that will get you. So if Harry Goett wasn't always doing his paperwork properly, that's something that worried Webb. But also it was a kind of hubris, because Webb wasn't an engineer, he was a bureaucrat, and even with the successes that he had with NASA, and they were vast, you know, he had tremendous successes. The more success he had, the more he thought it was actually down to the bureaucratic systems that he'd organized. So that by 1966, with everything at NASA running really, really smoothly and the organization humming along and quite happy, he said, okay, we need to change the management because I'm worried now. What if Bob Siemens retires from NASA? You know, what if I retire or get moved on? What if any of our senior engineers in charge of Apollo move on? What if Werner von Braun has a heart attack? How can we build a bureaucratic system here, a perfect organization that will continue to operate and is not dependent on individuals? And so he started tinkering around with this grand theory of building a perfect bureaucracy where the people could swap in and out, almost the way the astronauts were swappable. You know, if an astronaut came down with the measles or something, they'd swap him out for another astronaut, and that astronaut was just as well trained to carry on with the job. This is the vision that Webb had for NASA. The other bold vision he had for NASA was that if it was doing so well in launching humans into space and launching the Gemini program and preparing for Apollo, if it was doing so well building its ground facilities, its control centers, its data acquisition networks, its launch centers, was there some way in which the very successful management of that program could be fed into national life as a whole? Webb began to believe that you could solve the poverty problem, solve the housing problem, solve all kinds of social problems if you just applied the right kind of management to these large-scale problems. He thought that NASA had something to tell the world. And in a sense it did. He had a hard time convincing people of that, but he put $30 million a year into what he called the Sustaining Universities program, which was just about pumping out graduates and getting graduates just to be generally educated in engineering subjects and in technical subjects. And a lot of the NASA colleagues said, why are you spending $30 million a year, which is a lot of money in those days? What are you doing? You know, this is not about getting to the moon. This is not about building rockets. This is not about helping NASA. And Webb said, well, it's not about helping NASA. It's about getting NASA to help the country. NASA is now spending 3.5–4% of the federal budget on spaceflight. And I believe that that needs to be reflected on the ground as much as it's reflected on our achievements in space. Incredibly, Webb managed to get this $30 million a year under the radar of Congress because he hid it in the Office of Space Science budget. It was not a particular line item in its own right. And something like I don't know what it was, 7,000, 8,000 graduates a year for a good number of years benefited from this. Webb was also being politically savvy. He was saying, if I'm benefiting the academics, if I'm benefiting all those dreary professors who say that spaceflight is a waste of time, if I'm putting facilities on their campus, or if I'm giving them good graduate students, then they're less likely to lobby that spaceflight is a waste of time. So he was also building up his constituency. He had this ethos: I want to achieve 3 or 4 things with every one thing that I do. Everything that he did had this kind of double or triple edge to it. Now, Kennedy had left him alone up until late 1962, but started getting alarmed at obviously the money that was being spent and wondering, is there some chance here, if I go for a second term, you know, if I'm re-elected in 63, 64, if I go for a second term, at the very end of my term, can we see a lunar landing? That would be really good, a good note to go out on. You know, what happened in Dallas in 1963 clouds our memory. It clouds our memory that Kennedy was a president with every prospect of going for a second term and winning a second term. So when some of Webb's rivals in NASA started kicking up a fuss about, you know, we should not be doing sustaining universities program, we should not be doing too much space science and speculative astronomy, we shouldn't be worrying about Mars, we should put all the money into Apollo because that's what our president told us to do. So the president got wind of this and called Webb to a White House meeting and said, look, would you say that Apollo is the #1 priority of your space agency as I've directed it to be? And Webb said, well, no, sir, I would not. And there was this shocked silence. Well, what do you mean it's not the one priority? No, this is supposed to be. This is what we discussed. And Webb said, well, no, what we discussed is I was coming into NASA and I was not going to go to a pre-programmed brief. You were going to let me do things more or less the way I see fit. And I see it is definitely a priority to get to the moon, but it's not the only priority. Because we get to the moon, we'll do it, and it'll be over. But there are other things that we need to do. We need to understand the space environment overall. We need to do astronomy, we need to do space medicine, we need to understand other planets, because we have a long-term future in space. And Kennedy said, yeah, the long-term future, the weather satellites, the cosmic exploration, the astronomy, it's all wonderful stuff. We can do that anytime. We can do that some other time. Right now we have to get to the moon because the Russians are on our tail. And basically Webb argued and argued and argued and said that science and fundamental science in space was of critical importance, and he refused to step down, and he refused to accept any move that would divert money from other areas of NASA activities into Apollo. And so there was a real standoff with Kennedy over that, but Kennedy kind of just let the matter rest. But in NASA, Brainerd Holmes, who was actually head of the Apollo program at the time, said, you know, Webb is talking about science and astronomy and the totality of the program and overall preeminence in space. I think we ought to just be getting to the moon. That's what NASA ought to be spending its money on, and I can't put up with all this other nonsense. And so Webb said, okay, well, you're fired. So this took an enormous amount of confidence, because Time magazine and all these newspapers picked up on this and said, oh, you know, with the Russians snapping at our heels, there's a crisis in the Apollo lunar program, and the chiefs at the top of NASA can't agree on whether or not it's a priority, and oh my gosh. So Webb had taken a bold political gamble. Midstream developing Apollo, he'd sacked its chief. So now he needed, obviously, somebody else who was going to take over Apollo and run it. And so along came George Miller, and I think he was from the TRW company. M-U-E-L-L-E-R, I think his name was. And George Miller said, okay, well, I'll fix the problem. I'll get Apollo back on track, and I won't spend, you know, unduly more money than has been allocated. There were all kinds of other problems they had to face, like how are they going to get to the moon? The contract had been awarded to build the Apollo spacecraft, which would go to the moon and come back again. And gradually, of course, engineers in NASA realized that to do that, you would be carrying a tremendous weight penalty, and it just couldn't be done. Because if you carry your Earth return and re-entry hardware to the moon and then bring it back off the surface of the moon, it's just a ridiculous thing. The size of the rocket required to get off the ground in the first place from Earth would just be nonsensical. So they broke this down and decided to go for the lunar orbit rendezvous technique. And the White House science advisors were absolutely appalled by this notion of rendezvousing ships 250,000 miles out in space, you know, above the moon, far from any hope of rescue if anything went wrong. So again, Webb turned to his people in NASA and said, look, you're the engineers, I'm not the rocket scientist here. I have to trust you on this. And this sounds like a reckless, crazy thing to do, and it's completely at odds with any other program idea that we've ever talked about. You know, ever since the 1940s and 1950s, when we've been dreaming about getting to the moon, this is way, way different from anything we ever talked about before. Are you sure about this? And his engineers said yes. So Webb went to the White House and said, in the end, he said, look, NASA has chosen how it's going to get to the moon. We're having a lot of interference from the people who are building the capsule because they want their capsule to go down to the moon. We're having a lot of interference from the White House science advisors because they're saying this sounds too dangerous to them. But I'm telling you, my engineers in NASA have chosen this lunar orbit rendezvous as the way to go. We've even persuaded Werner von Braun, who's building the Saturn V booster, that this is the way to go. I will not brook any more interference. If the White House does interfere with me, you will have my resignation. Kennedy said, okay, you know, we won't interfere anymore. But again, Webb was savvy. He chose his moment for this confrontation very well. He chose it just as the Cuban Missile Crisis was heading up. So he had a canny timing as well. So again, he was taking huge risks here. He was putting his own job on the line. He was also trusting the decisions that NASA was making, and it was an extremely hazardous decision. Time and time again, he showed this trust in his engineers. He said, as long as you do your job, as long as you don't try to fudge the figures, as long as you don't lie to me, as long as you're honest with yourselves as well as with me, if you make engineering decisions that are technically valid, I will back you politically. Then in 1966, you had the Gemini program coming to its height, and Webb started spending less and less time dealing with daily NASA matters and more time going on the lecture circuit, talking about what a marvelous, trustworthy, collegiate and excellent management system he'd built up. And he started tinkering with it. And he started asking his senior NASA managers, how can we make this bureaucratic system so perfect that, you know, we are disposable and the bureaucracy will continue to run a good space program. He had got to the point where he was just being overtaken by his own bureaucratic dream. And of course that dream had a snake in it. And that snake in was, you know, if you excuse my language, shit happens. No bureaucracy can protect itself against just stuff that happens. No bureaucracy can protect itself against problems that it's not looking for. And of course we have the Apollo 1 fire, where what seems obvious now, that you can't use a pure oxygen environment in a capsule under pressure without having a substantial fire risk. Now, what's often not highlighted in the history books is why it was under pressure. Obviously, if you're in space, the atmospheric pressure inside the spacecraft is pressing outwards. And so you can have a low-pressure environment inside the spacecraft, and that's going to be enough for the astronauts to breathe. And a low-pressure liquid oxygen environment is not a particular hazard. But on the ground, when you're testing the spacecraft, and you want to keep it clean, and you want to do all of these other things, and you want to test the integrity of the hull by pressing the internal atmosphere outwards rather than by having the Earth's atmosphere press inwards, you have to put the cabin pressure inside the spacecraft unusually high, higher indeed than ordinary ground Earth atmospheric pressure. So they'd done this time and again with Mercury and time and again with Gemini, and they'd never ever had any problems. A schoolboy or a schoolgirl should have been able to tell them that pure oxygen under pressure is going to be a very dangerous thing. The slightest spark will trigger a catastrophe. But quite simply, it had never happened before, and no one knew to worry about this problem. They were, if you like, naive about it. It was a forgivable naivety. In retrospect, we think, my God, how could they have been so stupid? But it had never happened before. They'd never had any problem. So they had this extraordinary situation of an unfueled rocket with a capsule sitting on the launch pad during a routine checkout of its internal communication system, and the thing blew up. And the astronauts inside were asphyxiated. You know, there was a fire, but the primary thing that killed them was asphyxiation. So the fact that NASA had had these huge successes up to 1966 made this catastrophe seem doubly of a shock to the nation and to the politicians, because Webb has sold NASA as this perfect organization with this perfect bureaucracy and this very trusting environment where, with a can-do spirit. We can do things, we will do things, we do things. And all of a sudden they had this terrible failure. The astronauts didn't even have the dignity of dying in space like sort of lost explorers. They were sitting on the ground in a rocket that had no fuel in it, doing a test. So Webb had to explain this, and NASA had to explain this. Now George Miller, who had really taken over from Brainerd Holmes and was pushing the Apollo schedule and really ramrodding the program, he was a bit sort of alarmed. He was thinking, we have a tragedy here. The outside world is coming down on NASA as though we're victims. They're not giving us time to grieve. You know, we've lost colleagues in this capsule. If there had been a race driver and it was a brand new racing car and he'd smeared himself against the edge of the racetrack, everyone would understand those are the risks that you take when you're developing new technology. If it had a test pilot in a new plane, everybody would understand the risks. We have generals screwing up in Vietnam, losing thousands of soldiers in raids and military operations that haven't been thought through. They're not being castigated. But now we lose 3 astronauts in a program which has got huge risks attached to it, using vastly powerful technologies that we're only now beginning to experiment with. And we're being really blamed and blamed and blamed, and it seems unfair. But actually, as the Congressional inquiry got into its stride, it wasn't so much that NASA was blamed for. It was blamed more for the way it had presented itself as a perfect organization in which things could not go wrong. It was blamed as much as anything for the hubris, the pride, I think. And so the nation felt kind of let down. But it was Jim Webb's inability to give a straight answer that began to worry some people. Now, on paper and in his speeches and in his philosophy, Jim Webb was a great believer in democracy. He needed to get a consensus, at political level behind him to make Apollo work. But when it came to answering questions about, for instance, NASA's relationships with its contractors, and some of the decisions that had been made in the very early days of Apollo when these very large awards were being given out, and they were colossally large. They were billions of dollars large. They were like it would be the equivalent of $100 billion today, really large sums of money. So Congress said, okay, we've had this fire here, but we've also had seen some reports that maybe the construction standard in the capsule and the wiring wasn't as good as it should have been, and what have you got to say to that? And Webb said, oh, I haven't heard about this report. And the congressmen were squirming because they had this report sort of under their seat, and they were looking at it, but they couldn't really bring it out, and they couldn't bring it out into public because the procedures wouldn't allow it. But they kind of sensed that Webb was lying about something. They just didn't know about what. So again, along with the hubris, another slight flaw in his character is that he wasn't really very good at answering questions. He would demand answers from the people around him. When he was interrogated, he was this big, powerful man who maybe didn't like to be interrogated so well. So Webb now had a crisis, but he also had a political crisis. In 1961, when Yuri Gagarin went up into orbit, spaceflight was on every news channel. It was absolutely the priority. The battle between East and West, between communism and the free world, was taking place in space. In 1966, 1967, of course, the situation was very different. Vietnam was getting into its stride. American society was changing in fundamental ways. The fact that NASA had succeeded so often in the past in space was making people blasé about what it could do. You now had this disaster. You had Kennedy long dead. You had Lyndon Johnson under pressure and not going to be standing for another term. You had this change of mood where what Kennedy had promised in 1961 no longer seemed so important in 1967. And I'm telling you, there's a real mood that Apollo could have been shut down. Apollo could have been cancelled. Or at the very least, Apollo could have been delayed to the point that the Russians could have pulled off the following remarkable coup. We now know that they had a vast lunar booster and that they were trying to land a man on the moon. That was never going to succeed because they had a booster with 36 engines in its base, which had never been fired in harmony. So every time they tried to lift this thing off, it blew up. That was never going to work. But there was a rocket that had been developed called the Proton, which was good then and is still good today. That could have launched a stretch limo version of a Soyuz with one cosmonaut around the moon on a free return trajectory, and it could have brought him back. They were on the edge of trying to do this. They had administrative and political problems which didn't make this possible by 1968, 1969, but they might have been able to get away with it in 1970, and they probably would have tried if they'd felt that the Americans were faltering in their commitment to Apollo. Now, if the Soviets had launched a man around the moon and brought him home again, the distinction between that and actually putting a man on the surface would have been lost to the American general public, and that would have been a colossal, catastrophic Cold War defeat. So as Webb is sitting in Congress and he's taking the flak personally as well as bureaucratically, he's crippled by this, he's getting migraine headaches, his dream is shattered. He's finding that he's not building NASA up into this big agency anymore. He's not using NASA as an example of how to manage large-scale problems. He's defending NASA against cutbacks. He's defending Apollo against death. And he's defending his own reputation. He doesn't want to leave. He doesn't want to retire with this shadow casting over him. So he fights and fights and fights and says to Congress, look, I know things are bad now, but we mustn't use this as an excuse to cancel Apollo. And by the way, don't think the Russians have gone away. They've got big boosters out there. They can still beat us. And it was known as Jim Webb's booster. Everybody said, Jim Webb's going on about his booster again. He was teased because he said that the Russians were still a threat. So he knew that the only way of getting out of this impasse was to take the flak himself and to try and protect his engineers so that they could get on with Apollo. And a lot of the Apollo engineers and technicians have commented years later how, while Washington got on with this business of tearing apart headquarters and tearing apart Webb and George Miller and Bob Siemens, people at ground level were largely protected from this. People at ground level were largely able to carry on with the business of repairing the Apollo, instituting the fixes, carrying on building hardware. And that was a remarkable achievement that Webb protected them from a lot of that. What Webb had to do now was make something fly. And he had to turn to the contractors who had perhaps not built the Apollo to high enough standards and who had made some unacceptable cost overruns. There was all kinds of shady business there. And he turned to them and said, look, you have made me look bad. There's been this report internally generated by NASA a few years ago that said that your wiring was no good, that your construction standards were no good. There's this report which I've only now discovered because I've been busy in Washington, where my own managers are saying that they warned you your standards aren't good enough and that you're going to slip and that you're not going to be ready with a spacecraft until 1971 or 1972 at this rate. I'm telling you now that if you do not improve your performance, if you don't recognize the national importance of this, if you don't stop screwing around with this, then I'm going to cancel every project that we have with you and award Apollo to another manufacturer. Again, this was a huge gamble because if Webb had gone through on his promise and awarded the Apollo contract to another manufacturer, it would have delayed the landing to 1970, 71, 72 again. So it was a real mano a mano gamble he was taking. And North American Aviation, the company that was building Apollo, said, all right, well, we think we've been unfairly blamed for the fire. It's not our fault that you told us to use high-pressure oxygen in there. If you hadn't done that, the spacecraft would have been fine. It's not our fault we've had wiring problems, because every month you come up with change orders. Your staffers are impossible. They don't understand you can't change a spacecraft midstream. So there was a huge battle between the people who were building Apollo, who felt that they'd been unfairly blamed for the fire, and Jim Webb, who felt that the people who were building Apollo were not doing things his way. It's one of the extraordinary battles of Apollo, and it was bitter and it was vicious. There were resignations, there were a lot of tears. There were people in tears because this was a noble and wonderful dream they were trying to pursue. And now the infighting was, people were tearing at each other's throats, trying to find a way of seeing this program through. So Webb was exhausted by this stage. It was 1968. They were gearing up to fly Apollo again. They did get an Apollo into Earth orbit with a very bad tempered crew. They had head colds and the mood was not good. But at least they managed to show that Apollo could fly. The Saturn V was having its own problems, with vibration problems and failures. It was really, really difficult. So Webb was thinking, it's 1968 now, there's going to be an election soon. This is difficult, and we'd hoped that we were going to have a landing in 67 or 68. Now the landing is going to be 69, 70. There's going to be another administration in the White House by then. And guess what? It's not likely to be Democrat. Lyndon Johnson was not going to be putting himself forward for re-election. All the signs were that Richard Nixon or the Republicans were going to be in. What attitude would they take to this Kennedy dream of Apollo? What attitude would they take to NASA? Suddenly that dream that Jim Webb had of building a sustainable bureaucracy that would sustain through multiple administrations now became an urgent concern. So he went to Lyndon Johnson and he said, look, we have to think about the future here, because one day you're going to be stepping down soon, and it's likely there's going to be a Republican administration coming in maybe next year. We need to think about who's going to replace me at NASA, who's going to lead NASA after me, because I don't want to serve for a Republican, and I'm in my late 50s now and I'm exhausted. So let's just have a discussion about how we might see through this. And Johnson said, oh, so you're thinking of retiring? Absolutely, let's go outside and tell the press right away. Because Johnson, of course, had his own problems with corruption scandals and with Vietnam, and he was kind of weary of Jim Webb and kind of weary of this whole sense of difficulty that was going around it. So he said, right, let's go and replace you. So Webb found himself, much to his dismay, stepping down that very, very same day. But he'd organized his successor, which was one of his deputies called Tom Paine. So it was Tom Paine's name that appears on the NASA press releases of 1968 when they flew Apollo 8 around the moon, and of 1969 when they landed Apollo 11 on the moon. And so that gave me the impression that Tom Paine was the man who had made it all happen. Now, Tom Paine was a great and brilliant administrator, but he was not as great as Webb. He didn't have a chance to be because Richard Milhouse Nixon was in the White House. And Richard Nixon in 1961, when he'd been going up against a young and glamorous-looking John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon was a candidate then for the White House. And it's interesting, if you listen to the presidential debates on the radio, everybody said, well, I think Nixon came out of that really well. You know, he was logical, his arguments made sense. But if you saw the debates on television, everybody said, oh, Nixon looked sticky and sweaty and nervous and unshaven. John Kennedy just looked so much more presidential. So television killed Richard Nixon's chances of becoming president in the 1960s, and he forever blamed Kennedy for that. He felt that Kennedy had humiliated him. And so Richard Nixon was not well disposed toward NASA and spaceflight. He regarded the whole Apollo adventure as a constant reminder of John F. Kennedy's glamour. And I can tell you that when Apollo 11 came home, there was the plan was to send the U.S. Navy aircraft carrier John F. Kennedy to pick them up. That would have been appropriate. But the Nixon administration insisted that the USS Hornet be sent instead because he couldn't bear this association with Kennedy. So Tom Paine found himself having to cancel Apollo flights 18, 19, and 20 to the moon. But they managed to rescue one Saturn V booster for what Webb had always hoped was going to be the Apollo applications program. He felt that Wernher von Braun and NASA had created a gigantic launch vehicle here with a tremendous lift capability, a tremendous throw weight, and that it shouldn't be wasted. What Nixon managed to do was to put NASA into a situation where they had to think about shutting down the Saturn V production lines, just closing down that booster, even as it was beginning to show what it was capable of. So before I end Webb's story and talk briefly about what happened after him, here we have the story of a person who was brave enough to fight political battles on behalf of NASA, a good enough and trusting administrator who was able to give NASA that sense of achievement that you give people when you trust them, and someone who protected NASA and allowed it to survive a circumstance which might easily have closed down one of its most important programs. It might easily have closed down Apollo, certainly damaged Apollo very severely. So Webb was an incredibly brave man. He was also a powerful, combative, egotistical, ambitious man whose hubris sometimes took him into territories that were, going to let him down, where he was going to have failures. So in that sense, he was a historically interesting person. He was like a king or a general or an emperor of ancient times. He was someone magnificent and flawed. At the very least, he gave the notion of space administration color. Sometimes he was like a mafia boss. He wasn't above strong-arming people. The point I'm trying to make is that he was an interesting person, and he gave NASA an interesting personality at the time. There are a lot of people who loved him, just as many people who hated him, but no one was neutral about him. In retrospect, now that people have had time to assess the history of Apollo, they see the remarkable achievement of sustaining political support for any given high-technology program for 8, 9, 10 years at a stretch. That was a very remarkable thing, and that was probably his greatest legacy, to sustain support for Apollo through changing times, through changing White House administrations, through changing military preoccupations on the ground, through changing societies. He sustained support. And also what he did is he built the Launch Center in Florida. By placing the Mission Control Complex in Texas, about as far away from any other field center as it could be imagined, he managed to get you a broad sweep of constituency support, which helps you survive to this day. I believe that under the O'Keefe administration here, there was a question of amalgamating or rationalizing some of the field centers. Guess what? Couldn't be done. because right from the early 1960s onwards, Webb knew how to build a constituency for NASA which keeps you protected to this day. If you were all in just one state or just one field center, or if you were localized, and if your contractors were localized, you would be much more vulnerable than you are. You have this broad swathe of support. Still not enough in the Midwestern states, I would say, but you do still have a broad swathe of support, and that is one of the things that Webb helped to consolidate. You're living, in a sense, with the legacy, and the legacy of sheer scale and sheer infrastructure and ground facility investment that happened in the 1960s. You're living with that legacy today. I don't know how much time I have, but I'd like to talk about a little, perhaps more controversially, and by all means throw cabbages at me, about some of the things that have happened since Webb's day. Is that okay? Do I have time? Okay. Now, the interesting thing about the creation of the Apollo spacecraft is that in 1961, 1962, you had this enormous decision to make. First, what's the mission? It's to go to the moon. Second, how are we going to do it? It's called the mode decision. And there were all kinds of arguments, which we've already briefly touched on, about whether or not you go for Earth orbital assembly of components, like you're doing now with the Orion. Whether you do direct ascent, which is like the Tintin model, where you throw a rocket up there and you bring the rocket home. Or whether you do the lunar orbit rendezvous, which is eventually what you went for. Not one single piece of metal was cut on the Apollo spacecraft until the mission was assigned and the mode was determined. Obviously, that was the sensible way to go. Now, I don't think I'll have too many disagreements when I say that the ISS and the space shuttle have not been built on that basis. The space shuttle's missions were assigned pretty much as a justification for a vehicle that NASA had already decided to build. And the same has been true of the space station. And although there are many magnificent achievements, epic and inspirational things in both programs, I think it's worth pointing out that they were constructed the wrong way around. And I think that Jim Webb would have told you you're constructing those programs the wrong way around. You're deciding to build a piece of hardware first, and then you're assigning the mission. And then you're changing your minds about the missions as political pressure comes along, which means you have to change the hardware again. So I hope in future that you will always choose your missions first and then decide what spacecraft is appropriate. You will never again build a spacecraft and then decide what missions are appropriate. I'm going to await what happens with the Orion program with interest, but please bear those words in mind. I think that's about all I have to tell you about Jim Webb. What I'd like to do now is open up to Q&A, because I love that. I'd like to hear what you would like to know. And if you have any questions or anything that you would like to talk about an English person's outsider viewpoint of NASA as he studied it for these many years.
You mentioned in your book, just in one sentence, that James Webb had taken an interest in the idea of an orbiting observatory, became known as the Large Space Telescope, eventually became known as Hubble. Do you?
Yes, I meant to mention this. The Viking program, which landed on Mars, and the Voyager programs, I believe, there are a lot of programs where originally much larger spacecraft were envisaged, because Webb wanted to use Saturn V's for unmanned spacecraft as well as manned spacecraft. And Webb certainly was among the earliest audience for the possibility of a man-tended or a human-tended astronomical observatory. He was a great champion of it. It was one of the things that he wanted to see happen. And it's one of those programs that he wanted at least to put forward studies and to keep some kind of funding going, even when everybody else was telling him that's nothing to do with going to the moon. So yes, he was an early champion of it. And this is mentioned, I think, in the major histories of the origins of the Hubble program.
Could you say something, maybe I missed it, but about Webb's afterlife, NASA, in the sense of final days?
Yeah, his final days, he returned to law for a while. He was a regent at the Smithsonian Museum. He was one of the people instrumental in getting, I believe, the Air and Space Wing built up. He had Parkinson's disease for many years. There was a journalist called Joseph Trento who interviewed him when the Challenger blew up, and found him trying to defeat Parkinson's disease or work his way around it with the same tenacity as as he sort of fought for Apollo. And Webb was sad about the Challenger destruction because he said, you know, here's an agency which once could do fantastic things and now it can't do the simplest thing. And by the simplest thing he meant, you know, just routinely getting a vehicle safely into orbit. If you don't mind, I'm being controversial because I'm leaving in 2 days and it'll take that long for the police to find me. With the Apollo 1 fire, you had a circumstance which in retrospect you'd think, how could they not know? We have to be forgiving because they'd never ever had a circumstance of a fire in a capsule sitting on the ground before. They were taken by surprise by something which they just had no experience of. With the Challenger, you had repeated O-ring burn-through incidents, and with the loss of Columbia, I'm afraid you had repeated impacts on the lower thermal protection system. So these were incidents were what you guys would call flagged. They were flagged and flagged and flagged. Again, that's a qualitative difference between the Apollo 1 disaster and the problems that have happened with the shuttles. Now, I know how very, very complicated it is to keep track of all possible risks and to know which risks you really need to take seriously and which risks you can put on the back burner. Nevertheless, it was a surprise to me that NASA could ever, under any circumstances whatsoever, accept a flying machine that had pieces falling off it. That's as simple. It doesn't matter whether it was foam insulation, you had pieces falling off it. So again, it's just worth thinking about that if you have a problem that's flagged up and it's, you know, one of your janitors flagging up the problem, then you know, the program officers should be taking that seriously. Don't let middle management cut off the information flow from the top to the bottom and take everything seriously. It's you know, I know it's a daunting task, and there are 10 million and one things to keep on track of, but that's what you're paid for. You're paid to keep track of 10 million and one things, because it's the 10 million and 1th thing that will destroy your vehicle. There was a very, very interesting program that Joe Shea, who was one of the riding shotgun on the construction of the capsule, instituted. He had, not email, none of that kind of stuff, he had a notebook. It was quite a thick notebook, and what he would do is he would write his comments about how he thought the program was going, and then he would send that notebook out. His secretaries would send that notebook out, and across the course of the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, it would pass through all the significant offices at all different levels, upper and lower, and the junior technicians would get their hands on it, and they would read it. They would say, oh, well, what so-and-so said here about the, you know, the flush riveting? Okay, well, we've got the tool in room 405, you know, somebody should come and see me. And then that book would work its way through that everybody saw it. It was a transparent system. The middle managers couldn't say, oh, well, I'll deal with this. Everything was transparent. And then Joe Shea, as the person in charge of building the capsule overall, would see you know, what the electrical people were saying, what the designers of the hatch were saying, what the pyrotechnics people were saying, what the janitor was saying, you know. And everybody would be able to read everybody else's comments. It was an open system. I don't know whether that, I suppose it can happen in email, but I like the idea of this physical book because it's so simple. It's not a question of getting onto the right server. So sometimes an old-fashioned technique like that was a very good way for everybody to share everybody else's problems, and so that you have transparency across the system, and you don't have people trying to hide problems. That's the worst thing that can happen in a technical organization. It's what destroyed the Russians, people trying to hide problems. Sergei Korolev, who built the R-7 rocket, was a great one for transparency, and he would shout at people, but at the same time he would give them enough respect that they would feel that, okay, he's driving me hard, but at the same time, if I have a problem, I don't have to be afraid of telling him. The people who came after Korolev were much more concerned not to be given bad news. So never be afraid of bad news. Bad news is what will save your program. Bad news is what will make your vehicle fly. Sorry, I go on and on. I'm very interested in the philosophy of running programs, so it's one of my areas.
I want to do two things, but since the end of Apollo and the vision that Bush gave in 2004, NASA never really had national direction. So with that in mind, do you think it did pretty good with the science programs and everything, keeping no corruption? And, I mean, in general, for an agency with no...
believe me, I'm not having a go. But the achievements have been spectacular. I mean, if you look at everything that NASA has done, and you look at the science fiction predictions, it's just wonderful. You look at the Hubble repair, you look at... well, you look at Cassini. Now, well, I mean, we can go on about faster, better, cheaper, and thank God Cassini didn't get axed by Dan Goldin. But generally, you look at what NASA has achieved, it is, it's a space agency, it's a science fiction dream come true. The fact that you have had failures, I hope I haven't offended the people who walked out, the fact that you have had failures does not mean you shouldn't be congratulated. That's not the point. Of course there are going to be failures when you're dealing with vehicles that have the energy equivalent of a small thermonuclear bomb. Of course you're going to have failures. You're taking risks all the time. That's not what I'm saying. And I think the space shuttle has been absolutely a magnificent machine. It's done incredible things. I think the space station is fantastic. You see that. I mean, to be honest, I felt sorry for the Russians with Mir, because they were sending components up under remote control, and they were doing robotic docking, and it was a multi-module space station that looked like the cover of Analog Science Fiction magazine, 1955 or something. These dreams have been accomplished. It's just that the general public wants to see something other than the same view out the window. They want NASA to go somewhere. So I think the general public, the tax-paying public, is now pleased, perhaps, that NASA is going to go somewhere. And the general public responds well to those images coming back from far distant planets, and it's responded incredibly well to Hubble. Hubble, of course, at $7 billion, including the repair missions, has been an incredible bang for the buck, and it's something which the public has dearly loved. Fingers crossed that JWST will have a similarly wonderful future and maybe an easier launch, and it'll work out of the box. Let's hope it's plug and play.
It will. One of the things that you referred to is that he kept other programs alive, science alive, not just focusing on Apollo, and we're seeing that's an ongoing thing in terms of having science programs versus your manned program. Do you have any further commentary on that, or how it's going now, or the legacy of that?
Well, actually, if Pam doesn't mind my speaking out of turn, she said that this is a discussion where if one side says, we want resources, and another side says, we want the resources, in the end, everybody loses. NASA is about space exploration. The human and the robotic component, the science and the life component, they're all part and parcel of the same thing. In a sense, what's the point of finding out about the space environment with instruments unless we're actually going to go out there and be part of it? And at the same time, you need robots. Robotic exploration is essential, but it's in the end going to work parts and parcel with humans. Humans are more efficient than robots in the speed with which they can make decisions about what's interesting to look at. Robots are more efficient than humans because they're a lot cheaper and they're disposable. You're always going to need a combination of these things. So I'll be glad when NASA resigns itself to the budget realities, but doesn't necessarily feel one side or the other that my effort is more important and more fundamentally about space than some other guys.
My point was, it sounds like James Webb set a tone for it all being a big
Yes, he set a tone for an inclusive program, that the manned program wasn't more important than the unmanned program. They were part and parcel of an overall space capability. Because his view was you never know what's going to be important in 10 years' time. You never know what scientific discovery is going to be significant. You never know what humans are going to be capable out there. You never know what we're going to need to do. We need to do all of it. Now, the other thing is $16,000 million a year is roughly your annual budget. Now, in 1961, when you had just a bunch of swampland in Florida, and you had just a bunch of grassland in emission control, and you didn't know whether people would go insane or mad or their stomachs would explode once they were in weightlessness, you had a lot of investment to make in just the business of building infrastructure on the ground and building intellectual knowledge in space. You didn't even know how to rendezvous two spacecraft, you didn't know how to do any of this stuff. Now you do. You've got your ground facilities, you've got your long-standing infrastructure on the ground, you've got your intellectual leverage of knowing a lot about how to do space missions. I think you have to be wary now, and again, forgive me for speaking out of turn, you have to be wary that the general public will say $16,000 million is an adequate budget to get quite a lot done. Now, I agree you have to prioritize. Some things you'll have to say, we'll do these missions, we can't do those other missions. But I think after the cost overruns on ISS and the various problems with shuttle, the public, the people who are paying your salaries and paying for your institution, the public is going to want you to see you be driven by mission success and by getting on with things and getting stuff done, which you do. Is fantastic. But don't have any more of these crazy, crazy cost overruns, because I think you're living in a time now where the manned space program is on that cusp of survivability now. You have to make something fly, you have to do it in the time scale that you said that you would do it in, And next time you have a catastrophe, and you will, you have to show that that catastrophe happened in good faith and that no one was hiding anything. So I'm talking about, I keep my ear to the ground of what civilians are saying. The people who love your program and also the people who don't love your program. You're almost, I wouldn't say you're at a 1967 fire situation, but you are at a point where, as Jim Webb was saying, right, we now have to make something go fly. The only way of sustaining public support at this point, when we're on that cusp of people aren't sure if they believe in our manned program anymore, is we have to make something fly. So I'm very interested to see what Mike Griffin is going to do about Orion. I understand now that he is saying that because of the 400 million shortfall, that would push back the target date for flying Orion for the first time. And I would say that there is a concern which perhaps Congress will eventually address, and then they need to address it in a bipartisan way. How are you going to live with that gap between retiring the shuttles in 2010 and flying an Orion in maybe 2014-15? Also, the public perception is you went from flying a chimpanzee in 1961 to putting a man on the moon in 8 years. Why is it taking so long to do the same again? That's something that the general public is asking. Why does it take so long to do something you already know how to do? So these are problems for the taxpayer, that you have to convince the taxpayer that you're on top of these. And it is a surprise to the taxpayer that it's taking so long.
I guess the run-out cost of Apollo is documented pretty well, but I guess there's a thread where there was significant cost that was free to the nation just due to the dedication of the workforce.
Yes, yeah.
Any comment on?
I wouldn't say it was free, but you certainly got that. You got a certain amount of overtime and a certain amount of dedication that added to the quality of the hardware and added to keeping on schedule. Definitely. I mean, there were people who the divorce rate among NASA personnel in the 1960s was higher than anywhere else in the country because people were working 16-hour days and they were working Saturdays and Sundays.
On this point that you made a couple of times, that the fire was understandable because they had never experienced anything like that before. But yet you say, well, in retrospect, it was obvious, and the schoolgirl could have told them.
Yeah, so the old hindsight thing is perfect, isn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, isn't the real question is why was it designed that way in the first place?
It was designed that way because of the bends. If you have an oxygen-nitrogen environment in a spacecraft and you have any kind of depressurization, you're going to get the bends. Also, it was designed that way for system redundancy. If you have a two-gas system, you've got double the tankage and double the pipe work. So it was just deemed altogether simpler to do what aviators are used to in jet planes, is to fly in an oxygen environment. But of course, they're saying, yeah, aviators fly in an oxygen environment, fine. What they fail to take into account is that aviators don't fly in an oxygen environment in their cabin, which is higher than the ground pressure of ordinary air. That's the mistake they made.
So it was redesigned, was it?
It was redesigned, but they still flew a one-gas system. It's just that they redesigned so they wouldn't over-pressurize the spacecraft on the ground.
There was another problem with the spacecraft, and that was that they had built it so that the door, to open the door, you had to open it inward. They designed it so that the internal pressure would keep the seal tight.
Yeah.
All the previous spacecraft, the doors had been
exactly. Look at Gemini, where the doors were not only designed to open outwards, they were designed to fly outwards if the guys had to eject during a launch abort.
Part of the problem there in the fire was not only...
Well, it's very, very, very sad.
They couldn't open the door.
This is the stuff happens kind of theory of history. Gus Grissom, his hatch on the Mercury blew off when he came home, and he swears he did not touch the handle that would make it blow off. He swears that it just blew. So he was one of the people arguing that you have to have this inside sealing hatch. It was a complete unnecessary thing. Why build this hatch that was armor-plated like Fort Knox when your internal atmosphere inside the Apollo was not particularly significant? It was a dreadful, dreadful tragedy, and the irony is that what happened to Gus Grissom in Mercury, where he was determined that he didn't want that kind of hatch, is one of the things that contributed to killing him when he was aboard Apollo 1. You couldn't make that stuff up as a Greek tragedy, and it's just that's one of. I think that Apollo now is being assimilated by history, but in 100 years' time or 1,000 years' time, it'll become myth. People will talk about these stories and they will assign the mythic structures to them. Arthur C. Clarke has said that the time will come when Saturn V and Apollo is all that's remembered of the United States of America, or indeed any of our ancestors on the distant planet Earth.
Okay, thank you very much.